My name is Eric Mallard, and I've been married to a woman who collects men like vintage wine. She never throws away the old bottles, just keeps them around for special occasions. Julia's ex-boyfriend showed up at every family event. She called it being civil. I called it suspicious as hell, but apparently, that made me the paranoid husband in this little domestic theater we'd been performing for the past 3 years. I'm an architect by trade, which means I notice when things don't fit together properly. In buildings, misaligned foundations cause cracks. In marriages, they cause something much worse. They cause Christmas dinners where your wife's ex-fiancé gets the seat next to her while you're relegated to the kids' table end, making small talk with her teenage nephew about video games you've never played. Evan Bardsley owned the largest car dealership in our small New England coastal town of Millbrook. He was one of those guys who looked like he'd stepped out of a cologne advertisement. All white teeth and expensive haircuts, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. He'd been engaged to Julia 6 years ago, before I came along and supposedly swept her off her feet. At least, that's how she told the story. The truth was messier, like most truths are. "Rick, you're being ridiculous," Julia said, as we drove to her parents' house for their annual fall barbecue. She was adjusting her lipstick in the visor mirror, the same shade of red she'd worn on our first date. "Evan and I are friends. We were together for 4 years. We can't just pretend that never happened." "I'm not asking you to pretend anything," I said, navigating the winding road that led to the Hartwell family compound. "I'm asking why he needs to be at every single family gathering. He's not family." "He's practically family. Mom and Dad adore him." That was the problem, wasn't it? Lorraine and Tom Hartwell had never quite gotten over the fact that their eldest daughter had chosen a middle-class architect over the golden boy who could have given them grandchildren with trust funds. The Hartwell house sat on 3 acres of prime waterfront property, a colonial mansion that had been in the family for generations. My own house, a fixer-upper Victorian that I'd been slowly renovating for the past 5 years, could have fit in their garage with room to spare. I pulled into the circular driveway behind a familiar silver BMW. Of course, Evan was already there. He probably helped set up the tables. "There's his car," I said. Julia didn't look. "Rick, please, can we just have one nice afternoon? For me?" For her. Everything was always for her, wasn't it? The backyard was already buzzing with activity when we arrived. Lorraine Hartwell, resplendent in her autumn-themed sweater and pearls, descended upon us like a well-dressed hawk. "Julia, darling." She embraced her daughter with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for returning war heroes. "You look beautiful. That dress is stunning on you." "Thanks, Mom." Julia beamed under the attention. Lorraine's gaze shifted to me, and her smile dimmed by several watts. "Hello, Rick. How's the building business?" "Architecture, Mrs. Hartwell. Same as always." "Of course. Well, come along. Everyone's here." Everyone included Julia's younger sister, Lisa, her husband, Mark, their 2 kids, various aunts and uncles, family friends, and naturally, Evan. He was manning the grill like he lived there, wearing an apron that read Grill Master, and holding court with Tom Hartwell and a couple of other men I recognized from the country club. "Julia." Evan's face lit up when he saw her. He set down his spatula and opened his arms for a hug that lasted exactly 3 seconds too long. "You look incredible." "Thank you." She laughed, that musical sound that had first attracted me to her at a charity fundraiser 7 years ago. "How's business?" "Can't complain. Sold 3 luxury SUVs this week alone. This economy's been good to me." He nodded at me over her shoulder. "Rick, good to see you." "Evan." That was the extent of our conversation. It was always like this. Polite, surface level, 2 men circling each other like wary dogs who'd agreed not to fight, but hadn't agreed to like each other. I grabbed a beer from the cooler and found a spot at one of the picnic tables, watching the dynamics play out around me. This was my family now, by marriage. but I felt like an anthropologist studying a foreign tribe. The Hartwells had their own language, their own customs, their own hierarchy, and I'd never quite figured out where I fit in the pecking order. Lisa appeared beside me with her own beer. At 34, she was 3 years younger than Julia, but somehow seemed older, more grounded. She taught high school English and had the kind of practical wisdom that comes from dealing with teenagers all day. "You look thrilled to be here," she said, settling onto the bench beside me. "Just taking it all in." "Mom's in rare form today. She's been talking about Evan's new house all morning. Apparently, he bought the old Morrison place on Elm Street." The Morrison place was a Victorian mansion that had been on the market for 2 years, with a price tag that made my mortgage look like pocket change. Good for him. Julia seems excited about it. I looked at Lisa sharply. "What do you mean?" "Nothing specific. Just, she knows a lot of details about the renovations he's planning, the kitchen layout, the master bedroom suite, that kind of thing." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October breeze coming off the water. "How would she know that?" Lisa shrugged, but her expression was carefully neutral. "You'd have to ask her." Before I could respond, Lorraine called everyone to gather around the tables. The seating arrangement was, as always, a carefully choreographed dance of family politics. Julia ended up between her mother and Evan, while I found myself across the table next to Lisa's husband, Mark, who immediately launched into a detailed explanation of his latest home improvement project. I half-listened to Mark's dissertation on deck staining while watching Julia and Evan out of the corner of my eye. They weren't doing anything obvious, no hand-holding or inappropriate touching, but there was an ease between them that made my chest tight. They shared inside jokes, finished each other's sentences, and had the kind of comfortable familiarity that comes from years of intimacy. "Remember when you tried to make that soufflé for my birthday?" Julia was saying, laughing at some memory I wasn't part of. "And it collapsed the moment I opened the oven door," Evan replied, grinning. "You cried." "I did not cry. I was disappointed." "You cried. I have photographic evidence." "You better not still have those photos." "I keep all my treasures." The way he said it, looking directly at her, made something twist in my gut. I took a long pull from my beer and tried to focus on Mark's riveting tale of wood-stain selection. The afternoon wore on with the usual Hartwell family rhythm, multiple conversations happening simultaneously, children running around the yard, Lorraine orchestrating everything from her position at the head of the table like a conductor leading an orchestra. I played my part, made the appropriate responses, laughed at the right moments, but part of me was always watching Julia and Evan. They disappeared twice during the gathering. The first time, Julia claimed she was giving Evan a tour of the new garden shed Tom had built. They were gone for 20 minutes. The second time, Evan needed help carrying something from his car, and Julia volunteered to assist. Another 15 minutes. Each absence felt like a small betrayal, a crack in the foundation of our marriage that I was probably imagining but couldn't ignore. "You're quiet today," Tom Hartwell said, settling into the chair beside me as the afternoon wound down. Julia's father was a decent man, a retired insurance executive who'd always treated me with polite respect, if not warmth. "Just enjoying the family time," I said. "Julia seems happy. That's what matters most to Lorraine and me, our daughter's happiness." There was something in his tone, a weight to the words that made me look at him more carefully. "Of course. Marriage is work," he continued, staring out at the water. "Takes effort from both people. Communication. Trust. Yes, sir. Sometimes people grow apart. Sometimes they realize they were better suited to someone else all along." My hand tightened on my beer bottle. "Is there something specific you're trying to tell me, Tom?" He met my eyes then, and I saw something that might have been sympathy. Just that life's too short to spend it in the wrong place with the wrong person, for everyone involved. Before I could respond, Julia appeared at my shoulder. "Ready to go?" I have an early meeting tomorrow. The ride home was quiet. Julia stared out the passenger window while I navigated the familiar roads back to our neighborhood. Our house looked small and shabby after an afternoon at the Hartwell estate, the Victorians peeling paint and overgrown garden a stark contrast to the manicured perfection we'd just left. "Did you have a good time?" Julia asked as we walked up the front steps. "Sure, always a pleasure." She caught the sarcasm in my voice. "What's wrong now?" "Nothing's wrong. Just wondering why Evan needed 2 private tours of your parents' property." "Oh, for crying out loud." She fumbled with her keys, frustration evident in her voice. "We looked at the garden shed because he's thinking of building one at his new place, and he needed help carrying a case of wine from his car for Mom. You're being paranoid." "Am I?" "Yes, you are. Evan and I are friends, Rick. Just friends. I'm sorry if that makes you uncomfortable, but I'm not going to cut him out of my life because you're insecure." Insecure. That word again. It was her favorite weapon, deployed whenever I questioned anything about her relationship with Evan. According to Julia, my concerns weren't legitimate. They were just evidence of my own inadequacy. We went to bed that night without resolving anything, lying on opposite sides of our king-size mattress, like strangers sharing a hotel room. I stared at the ceiling and listened to Julia's breathing slow into sleep, my mind replaying the afternoon's events and Tom Hartwell's cryptic warnings. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones, the way you can sense a storm coming long before the first clouds appear on the horizon. The question was, what I was going to do about it. The answer came to me the next morning when I found Julia in the kitchen, dressed for her job at the Millbrook Community Foundation, in a navy suit that hugged her curves in all the right places. She was scrolling through her phone while sipping coffee from her favorite mug, a gift from Evan that read, "World's Best Non-Profit Director." "I might be late tonight," she said without looking up. "Board meeting. On a Tuesday?" "Emergency session. Budget crisis." She grabbed her purse and headed for the door. "Don't wait up." She kissed my cheek, a perfunctory gesture that felt more like a business transaction than an expression of affection, and then she was gone, leaving behind only the scent of her perfume and a lingering sense of unease. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she left, drinking coffee that had gone cold and thinking about trust, communication, and the growing distance between the woman I'd married and the stranger who shared my bed. Then I picked up my phone and called Dave Morrison, my best friend since college, and the only person I trusted to tell me the truth, even when it hurt. "I need to ask you something," I said when he answered, "and I need you to be honest with me." "Shoot. Do you think Julia's having an affair?" The pause that followed lasted exactly long enough for my heart to sink. "Rick," Dave's voice was careful, measured. "What makes you ask that?" "Just answer the question, Dave, please." Another pause. "I don't know for sure, but if I had to bet money on it, yeah, man, I think she might be." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting them. Confirmation of your worst fears never gets easier, no matter how prepared you think you are. With Evan? That would be my guess. I closed my eyes and felt something fundamental shift inside me, like tectonic plates rearranging themselves deep beneath the surface. When I opened them again, the world looked different, sharper, clearer, stripped of the comfortable illusions I'd been clinging to. "Rick, you okay?" "Yeah," I said, surprised to find that I meant it. "I'm okay." For the first time in months, I actually was, because now I knew what I was dealing with, and knowledge, even painful knowledge, was better than uncertainty. I had work to do. The law office of Knox, Patterson and Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a converted textile mill in downtown Millbrook, all exposed brick and industrial windows that let in the kind of harsh light that made everyone look either dramatic or guilty. I was hoping for dramatic as I sat in the waiting room, thumbing through a magazine I wasn't reading and trying to ignore the way my palms were sweating. Carla Knox had a reputation in town as the lawyer you hired when you wanted to win, not when you wanted to play nice. She'd handled 3 of the messiest divorces in Millbrook's recent history, and according to Dave, who'd witnessed one of them secondhand through his ex-wife's sister, Carla had a talent for finding pressure points that her opponents didn't even know they had. Mr. Mallard, the receptionist, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of efficient demeanor that suggested she'd seen every variety of human drama, gestured toward the inner office. Ms. Knox will see you now. Carla Knox was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with short auburn hair and intelligent green eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and when she shook my hand, her grip was firm enough to crack walnuts. "Please sit down," she said, settling behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of mahogany. "I understand you're interested in discussing your marriage. My wife is having an affair." The words came out more bluntly than I'd intended, but there was something about Carla's direct manner that cut through the usual social niceties. "How do you know?" "I don't have photographs, if that's what you're asking. But I know." "Tell me what you do have." So I did. I told her about Evan's constant presence at family events, about the private conversations and synchronized absences, about Tom Hartwell's cryptic warnings and Dave's confirmation of my suspicions. I told her about the late meetings that had become more frequent, the new clothes that appeared in Julia's wardrobe, the way she'd started taking her phone with her everywhere, even to the bathroom. Carla listened without interruption, taking notes on a legal pad and handwriting so neat it could have been printed. When I finished, she set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. "None of what you've told me constitutes proof of adultery," she said. "But it's a compelling circumstantial case. The question is what you want to do about it." "I want a divorce." "Do you want to try to catch her in the act first? It might strengthen your position in terms of asset division." I thought about that for a moment. The idea of hiring a private investigator, of skulking around parking lots with a camera, of reducing my marriage to a series of surveillance photographs, made me feel sick. "No," I said. "I don't want to turn this into some kind of spy novel. I just want out, and I want to make sure I'm protected financially." "Smart. Clean is better than messy, and Massachusetts is a no-fault state anyway. Her affair won't impact the divorce proceedings significantly, but it might give us leverage in negotiations." She pulled out a fresh legal pad. "Let's talk about assets." The next hour was a crash course in the practical realities of ending a marriage. We discussed the house, bought before the marriage, but improved significantly during it with Julia's financial contributions. My retirement accounts, her salary from the foundation, the joint checking and savings accounts we'd accumulated over 7 years together. "What about debts?" Carla asked. "Just the mortgage and our credit cards, maybe 30,000 total." "Children?" "No." That had been a source of tension between us for the past 2 years. Julia wanted to wait until we were more financially stable, until she'd achieved certain career milestones, until the timing was perfect. I was starting to suspect that she'd been waiting for something else entirely. That simplifies things considerably. No custody issues, no child support calculations. Carla made another note. "Given what you've told me about the asset distribution and the length of the marriage, you're looking at a relatively straightforward division of property. She'll likely be entitled to roughly half of everything acquired during the marriage, but you should be able to keep the house if you can refinance to buy out her equity stake." "How long does the process take?" "If she doesn't contest it, we could have everything finalized within 6 months. If she fights it..." Carla shrugged. "Could be a year or more." "She won't fight it." I was surprised by my own certainty. She wants out as much as I do. She's just been too comfortable to make the first move. You might be surprised how people react when they're actually faced with divorce papers. Even people who want out sometimes panic when the reality hits them. I thought about Julia, about her need to control the narrative of her own life, to be seen as the victim rather than the villain. Carla was probably right. Julia might very well fight the divorce, not because she wanted to save our marriage, but because she couldn't stand the idea of being the woman who got left. "What's your retainer?" I asked. $5,000 to start. That should cover the initial filing and negotiations. If things get complicated, we'll discuss additional fees. I wrote the check, feeling like I was purchasing my freedom one expensive hour at a time. Carla gave me a list of documents to gather: tax returns, bank statements, property deeds, insurance policies, and scheduled a follow-up appointment for the following week. "One more thing," she said as I stood to leave. "Don't confront your wife about the affair until we've had a chance to secure your financial position. If she knows you're planning to file for divorce, she might try to hide assets or run up debt on joint accounts." "How long do I have to pretend everything's normal?" "A few weeks at most. We'll move quickly." I left the law office feeling lighter than I had in months, despite the $5,000 hole in my checking account. For the first time since I'd started suspecting Julia's infidelity, I had a plan. I had an advocate. I had hope that this nightmare would eventually end. The next few weeks passed in a strange kind of suspended animation. I went to work, came home, made dinner, watched television, and went to bed beside my wife, all while knowing that our marriage was already over in everything but name. Julia seemed oblivious to my changed demeanor, or maybe she was just too distracted by her own secret life to notice. The late meetings became more frequent. 3 nights a week, sometimes 4. She started going to the gym more often, claiming she'd hired a personal trainer. New lingerie appeared in her dresser drawer, black lace and silk in styles she'd never worn for me. "You're looking good," I told her one morning as she got dressed for work in a fitted red dress I'd never seen before. "Thank you." She smiled, but it was the kind of smile you give to a friendly acquaintance, not your husband of 7 years. "I've been working out more. The personal trainer's paying off. Definitely worth the investment." I wondered if Evan was her personal trainer, or if that was just another lie in the elaborate fiction she'd constructed around her affair. It didn't matter. In a few days, none of it would matter. Carla had filed the divorce papers on a Wednesday morning in early December. Julia would be served at work on Friday, a calculated decision to avoid a scene at home and to give her the weekend to process the news before we had to face each other again. But first, there was one more family gathering to endure. The Hartwell Christmas dinner was a Millbrook institution, an annual celebration that drew not just immediate family, but an extended network of friends, neighbors, and business associates. Lorraine spent weeks preparing for it, turning her house into something that belonged in a magazine spread about New England holiday traditions. This year's guest list included the usual suspects, plus a few additions: Tom's business partner and his wife, a couple from Julia's book club, and of course, Evan. He'd been coming to Hartwell Christmas dinners for 6 years running, first as Julia's fiancé, then as her ex-fiancé, and now as, what exactly? The family friend who happened to be sleeping with the host's daughter? I arrived at the Hartwell house that Saturday evening with a bottle of expensive wine and a secret that felt like a loaded weapon in my chest. Julia had spent an hour getting ready, changing clothes 3 times before settling on a green velvet dress that made her look like a Christmas angel with a guilty conscience. "You look beautiful," I told her as we walked up the front steps, and I meant it. She did look beautiful. She also looked like a stranger. "Thank you." She squeezed my arm, a gesture that might have seemed affectionate to outside observers, but felt more like a performance for the neighbors who might be watching from their windows. The house was already full when we arrived, warm with the scent of cinnamon and pine, bright with the glow of a dozen candles and the massive Christmas tree that dominated the living room. Lorraine had outdone herself with the decorations, turning every surface into a winter wonderland of gold and silver and deep forest green. "Julia, darling." Lorraine swept over to embrace her daughter, resplendent in a burgundy silk dress and enough jewelry to stock a small boutique. "And Rick, how lovely to see you." The temperature of her greeting had warmed considerably over the years, though I suspected that had more to do with social politeness than genuine affection. Lorraine Hartwell was nothing if not a gracious hostess. "Mrs. Hartwell, you've outdone yourself," I said, handing her the wine. "The house looks incredible." "Thank you, dear. Tom's in the kitchen if you'd like to say hello. Julia, Evan's been asking about you." Of course he had. I found Tom in the kitchen, carving a turkey that looked like it could feed a small army. He was wearing a festive red sweater that I suspected was Lorraine's doing. Left to his own devices, Tom would have worn a golf shirt to his own funeral. "Rick, good to see you." He wiped his hands on a dish towel and shook mine. "How's business?" "Can't complain. The new shopping center project is keeping me busy." "Excellent. Nothing like steady work." He returned to his carving, and for a moment we stood in comfortable silence, two men hiding out in the kitchen while their wives orchestrated the social dynamics in the living room. "Tom," I said, surprising myself with my own boldness. "That conversation we had at the fall barbecue, about marriage being work." His hand stilled on the carving knife. "What about it?" "Did you know? About Julia and Evan?" He set down the knife and looked at me directly for the first time since I'd entered the kitchen. His expression was sad, resigned, and unmistakably guilty. "I suspected," he said quietly. "I hoped I was wrong." "How long?" "The suspicions? Maybe 6 months. But Rick, I don't have proof, and it's not my place to—" "It's okay," I said. "I know. What are you going to do?" I thought about the divorce papers sitting in Carla Knox's office, about the serving process that would begin on Monday morning, about the bomb I was about to drop in his living room. "I'm going to handle it," I said. Tom nodded slowly. "If there's anything Lorraine and I can do, just take care of your family. This isn't your fault." But even as I said it, I wondered if that was entirely true. The Hartwells had welcomed Evan back into their family circle, had given him a place at their table and tacit approval for his relationship with their married daughter. They might not have intended to enable the affair, but they'd certainly made it easier. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, a feast laid out on Lorraine's grandmother's china, with enough silverware to confuse an etiquette expert. I found myself seated between Lisa and Tom's business partner, directly across from Julia and Evan, who were deep in conversation about his renovation plans. "The master suite is going to be incredible once it's finished," Julia was saying. "The bathroom alone is bigger than most people's bedrooms." "You'll have to come see it when it's done," Evan replied. "I'd love to get your opinion on the decorating choices." "I'd like that." The casual intimacy of the exchange, conducted in front of her husband and extended family, was breathtaking in its audacity. I took a sip of wine and marveled at how easy it was for them, how natural the deception had become. Lisa caught my eye and raised an eyebrow. She'd been watching the same performance, and her expression suggested she was as disgusted as I was. "How's the renovation going, Evan?" I asked, my voice perfectly pleasant. "Must be expensive doing all that work." "Worth every penny," he said. "I'm finally getting the house I've always wanted." "And Julia's been helping with the design choices?" "She has excellent taste." "Yes, she does." I smiled at my wife, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable. She's always been good at getting what she wants. The conversation moved on to safer topics: Tom's golf game, Lorraine's charity work, the unusually mild December weather. I participated when necessary, laughed at the appropriate moments, and waited for my opportunity. It came during dessert, when Lorraine was serving her famous apple pie and Tom was pouring coffee from the silver service that had been in his family for 3 generations. The room was warm with food and wine and the comfortable satisfaction that comes from a successful dinner party. I stood up, my coffee cup in hand, and cleared my throat. "I'd like to make a toast," I said. The conversation died as all eyes turned to me. Julia looked puzzled, Evan slightly annoyed at having his story about a difficult customer interrupted. Lorraine beamed with the pleasure of a hostess whose gathering was being properly honored. "This has been a wonderful evening," I continued, "and I want to thank Tom and Lorraine for their hospitality. This is actually my last Christmas dinner with the Hartwell family." A few confused smiles, the beginning of polite protests about how I was part of the family now. "Julia and I are getting divorced," I said. "The papers will be served on Monday." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Forks suspended halfway to mouths, coffee cups frozen in mid-sip, every face around the table wearing the same expression of shock. Evan choked on his wine, coughing violently into his napkin. His face turned red, then purple, as he struggled to catch his breath. "How long?" Lorraine's voice was barely a whisper. I looked directly at Julia, whose face had gone white, except for 2 bright spots of color on her cheeks. Then I shifted my gaze to Evan, who had finally stopped coughing but looked like he might be sick. "Ask them," I said. The aftermath of Christmas dinner played out like a slow-motion car accident. Lorraine Hartwell, pillar of Millbrook society and orchestrator of perfect family gatherings, stared at her eldest daughter with the kind of expression usually reserved for strangers who've just tracked mud across your white carpet. Julia? Her voice carried the weight of 37 years of motherhood, of piano lessons and dance recitals and college tuition payments, of dreams and expectations that were crumbling in real time. "Is this true?" Julia's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. Beside her, Evan had gone from purple back to his normal color, but he looked like he wanted to crawl under the antique Persian rug and disappear. "Mom, I can explain." "Can you?" Tom Hartwell set down his coffee cup with the kind of deliberate control that suggested he was barely holding himself together. "Because I'd very much like to hear that explanation." The rest of the dinner guests, Tom's business partner, the book club friends, various cousins and family friends, sat frozen in their chairs, caught between the human instinct to flee from awkward situations and the darker impulse to witness a spectacular social disaster. "Perhaps," said Tom's business partner's wife, a woman with enough social experience to navigate these treacherous waters, "we should give the family some privacy." "No." I remained standing, my coffee cup steady in my hand despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Everyone here has been part of this charade. Everyone here has watched Evan play house with my wife at family gatherings for the past year. You all deserve to know the truth." "Rick, please." Julia found her voice, but it came out as a croak. "Please what? Please continue pretending? Please keep letting everyone think I'm the paranoid husband while you and Evan sneak around behind my back?" "We weren't sneaking around," Evan said, finally managing to speak. "We were just what?" I turned to face him directly. "Just friends? Just catching up on old times? Just touring garden sheds and discussing bathroom renovations?" Lisa, who had been watching the entire scene with the fascination of someone witnessing a historical event, set down her fork and leaned back in her chair. "How long has this been going on?" Julia looked at her sister with something that might have been betrayal. "Lisa, you don't understand." "I understand plenty. I understand that you've been making a fool of your husband in front of the entire family. I understand that you've been lying to Mom and Dad. What I don't understand is how you thought you could keep getting away with it." "That's enough." Lorraine's voice cut through the rising tension like a blade. She stood up from her chair with the dignity of a queen addressing her court, but her hands were shaking. "Evan, I think you should leave. Mrs. Hartwell, I want you to know that Julia and I never intended for things to happen this way. Leave, now." Evan looked at Julia, some silent communication passing between them, and then pushed back from the table, "I'm sorry," he said, though it wasn't clear who he was apologizing to. "I'm truly sorry." He left through the kitchen, and a moment later, we heard the front door close. His BMW started up in the driveway, and then he was gone, leaving behind only the scent of his expensive cologne and the wreckage of what had been, up until 10 minutes ago, a perfect Christmas dinner. "Julia," Tom said quietly, "I think you owe us all an explanation." What followed was a confession that had all the hallmarks of a carefully prepared legal defense. Julia admitted to the affair but framed it as an emotional connection that had gotten out of hand, a rekindling of old feelings that she'd tried to resist. She claimed it had only been going on for a few months, that it was more emotional than physical, that she'd been planning to end it after the holidays. I listened to her performance with something approaching admiration. She was good at this, good at spinning a narrative that cast her as the confused victim of circumstances rather than the architect of betrayal. If I hadn't spent the past month documenting her lies, I might have almost believed her myself. "A few months?" I said when she finished. "Julia, you've been having late meetings 3 nights a week since September. You've been taking weekend trips to Boston for work conferences that don't exist. You bought lingerie that I've never seen you wear. You've been spying on me? I've been paying attention. There's a difference." Lorraine sank back into her chair, looking older than I'd ever seen her. "Julia, how could you do this? To Rick, to your marriage, to this family?" "Mom, you don't understand the pressure I've been under. The foundation is going through budget cuts. Rick and I have been growing apart for years, and when Evan came back into my life—" "When did he come back into your life?" Lisa asked. "Because he's been at every family gathering for the past 3 years. That's different. We were just friends then." "When did it change?" Tom's voice was quiet but implacable. Julia looked around the table, searching for an ally and finding none. Even the dinner guests who weren't family were staring at her with the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for traffic accidents. "Last spring," she said finally, "after the Easter dinner, we started talking more, texting, meeting for coffee." "Meeting for more than coffee," I said. "Rick, please, no. No more, please. No more lies. No more asking me to be understanding while you make a fool of me in front of everyone who matters to us." I set down my coffee cup and looked around the table at the faces of people who had been, for 7 years, my family. Some looked sympathetic, some looked disgusted, and some just looked uncomfortable, but none of them looked surprised. "How many of you knew?" I asked. The silence stretched long enough to answer the question. "I suspected," Lisa said finally. "I didn't want to believe it, but I suspected." "I saw them together at the Harbor Grill in October," admitted one of the book club friends. "They looked intimate." "My neighbor's daughter works at the Marriott in Portsmouth," said another. She mentioned seeing them there together several times. Each revelation was another nail in the coffin of Julia's carefully constructed narrative. The affair hadn't been a recent emotional slip. It had been a months-long deception conducted in full view of half the town. Julia's face crumpled. "I never meant for it to happen this way." "How did you mean for it to happen?" I asked. "Were you planning to ask for a divorce, or were you just going to keep stringing me along indefinitely?" "I don't know, I was confused, I was scared." "You were comfortable," Lisa said bluntly. "You had a husband who paid half the bills, and a boyfriend who made you feel special. Why choose when you could have both?" "That's not fair." "None of this is fair," Tom said. "Fair would have been ending your marriage before starting another relationship. Fair would have been honest communication instead of lies and deception." The dinner party broke up shortly after that, guests making awkward excuses and hasty exits until only the immediate family remained. Julia retreated to her childhood bedroom, claiming she needed time to think. Lorraine disappeared into the kitchen to deal with the dishes and her emotions in private. Tom and I ended up in his study sharing a bottle of bourbon that was older than my marriage. "I'm sorry, Rick," he said, staring into his glass. "I should have said something sooner." "It's not your fault, isn't it? We welcomed him back into this family. We gave him a place at our table, treated him like a son. We enabled this. Julia's a grown woman. She made her own choices. She's our daughter. We raised her to be better than this." I thought about that, about the entitled princess who had grown up in this house, who had been taught that she deserved the best of everything and that other people's feelings were secondary to her own happiness. "Maybe you did," I said. "Maybe this is exactly who she's always been, and I just didn't want to see it." Tom finished his bourbon and poured another. "What happens now?" "Now I go home and pack her things. The divorce papers get served on Monday. We divide up 7 years of shared assets and pretend we never knew each other." "And Evan?" I smiled, and it wasn't a particularly nice expression. "Evan gets exactly what he wanted. He gets Julia, with all the baggage that entails. No more sneaking around, no more secret meetings, no more playing the role of the family friend. He wanted her. He can have her." "That sounds almost like revenge." "No," I said. "Revenge would be making them pay for what they did to me, to this family, to everyone who cared about our marriage. This is just justice. They get each other, and they get to live with the consequences of how they got together." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. Part of me, a part I wasn't particularly proud of, wanted them to suffer the way they'd made me suffer. Wanted them to face the same humiliation and betrayal they'd inflicted on me. That part would get its wish, though I didn't know it yet. I drove home alone that night, leaving Julia to face her parents' disappointment and her own guilt. Our house felt different when I walked through the door. Smaller, quieter, already touched by the loneliness that was coming. I poured myself a drink and sat in the living room we'd decorated together, looking at the Christmas tree we'd picked out just 2 weeks earlier, and tried to figure out how I'd gotten to this point. The truth was, I'd been sleepwalking through my marriage for years, accepting Julia's explanations and excuses because it was easier than facing the alternative. I'd been the comfortable husband, the reliable provider, the safe choice who paid the bills while she looked for something more exciting. Well, she'd found it. And now, she could live with it. My phone buzzed with a text message. "Julia, I'm staying at my parents' tonight. We need to talk tomorrow." I typed back, "Talk to my lawyer. Her name is Carla Knox." Then I turned off my phone and went to bed in the house that would soon be mine alone. And for the first time in months, I slept like a baby. The serving of divorce papers on a Monday morning in December is not, as it turns out, a private affair when it happens at the offices of the Millbrook Community Foundation. Julia's assistant called me at work to tell me that my wife had locked herself in her office and was refusing to see anyone, including her boss. "She's been crying for 2 hours, the assistant said. "Should I call someone?" "Call her sister," I said, "or her mother. Don't call me." By Tuesday, the news had spread through Millbrook's social networks like wildfire through dry grass. Our town had maybe 8,000 residents, and at least half of them seemed to have opinions about my marriage's spectacular implosion. The story had everything a good gossip needed: adultery, public humiliation, prominent families, and a Christmas dinner that would be talked about for years. Dave Morrison found me at lunch on Wednesday, sliding into the booth across from me at Murphy's Diner with the kind of grin that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment. "So," he said, "I hear you've had an eventful week." "News travels fast." "Brother, this isn't news. This is entertainment. Half the town's been waiting for you to figure out what everyone else already knew." Everyone knew? Everyone suspected. Julia and Evan weren't exactly subtle. My ex-wife saw them at 3 different restaurants over the past 6 months, always sitting too close, always looking like they were sharing secrets. I thought about all the times I'd dismissed my own instincts, all the times I'd accepted Julia's explanations, because I didn't want to deal with the alternative. I feel like an idiot. You're not an idiot. You're a guy who trusted his wife. That used to be considered a virtue. Used to be. Dave ordered coffee and a piece of pie that could have fed a small family. So what's the plan? Quiet divorce, split everything 50-50, pretend it never happened? That was the plan. Was? I looked out the window at the main street of the town where I'd lived for 7 years, where I'd built a business and a reputation, and what I'd thought was a life. Where everyone now knew that my wife had been cheating on me with her ex-fiancé while I played the role of the oblivious husband. I'm not sure anymore, I said. Part of me thinks they should face some consequences for what they did. What kind of consequences? I don't know yet, but something more than just getting what they wanted all along. Dave raised an eyebrow. That sounds dangerously close to revenge, my friend. Maybe it is. Just remember that revenge is a dish best served cold, and in this case, it's already been sitting in the freezer for about 6 months. He wasn't wrong. Julia and Evan had been serving me humiliation a little bit at a time for months, letting me twist in the wind while they conducted their affair in plain sight of everyone who mattered. Maybe it was time to return the favor. That afternoon, I called Carla Knox and asked her a question that would change everything. Hypothetically, I said, if someone wanted to make sure that an adultery case got maximum public attention, how would they go about doing that? Hypothetically, she replied, they might consider that Massachusetts has very liberal public records laws. Divorce filings, including affidavits alleging adultery, become part of the public record within 24 hours of filing. And if someone happened to tip off a reporter about an interesting public filing, that would be entirely legal, though perhaps not entirely kind. Kindness, I said, is overrated. Mr. Mallard, are you sure you want to go down this road? Once you make this public, there's no taking it back. I thought about Julia's performance at Christmas dinner, about her carefully crafted victim narrative, about the way she'd made me complicit in my own humiliation by asking me to be understanding, to be mature, to be the bigger person. I'm sure, I said. Then let's talk about strategy. Jennifer Walsh had been covering local news for the Millbrook Gazette for 3 years, long enough to know that most of what passed for news in our small town involved school board meetings, zoning disputes, and the occasional drunk driver wrapping their car around a telephone pole. A messy divorce involving prominent local families, complete with adultery allegations and a Christmas dinner confrontation that had already become local legend, was the kind of story that made a small-town reporter's career. I met her at a coffee shop in Portsmouth, far enough from Millbrook to avoid being seen by anyone who mattered, close enough to make the drive without feeling like I was fleeing the state. Jennifer was younger than I'd expected, maybe 30, with short blonde hair, and the kind of sharp intelligence that suggested she wouldn't be working for a small-town newspaper much longer. Mr. Mallard, she said, sliding into the booth across from me. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Thank you for being discreet about it. She pulled out a digital recorder and set it on the table between us. Do you mind if I record this conversation? Actually, I do. This is background only. No direct quotes, no attribution. Fair enough. She put the recorder away and pulled out a notebook instead. So tell me about your marriage. What followed was the strangest interview of my life. I found myself laying out the details of my personal disaster for a woman I'd never met, watching her take notes as I described the slow dissolution of my marriage and the very public way it had ended. The Christmas dinner sounds like something out of a soap opera, she said when I finished. It felt like one too. And you're alleging that the affair had been going on for how long? At least 8 months, possibly longer. Do you have proof? I thought about the photographs that Carla's investigator had taken, the credit card receipts from hotels and restaurants, the phone records that showed hundreds of calls and texts between Julia and Evan's personal numbers. I have enough, I said, Enough for what? Enough to make sure that everyone who enabled this affair, everyone who watched it happen and said nothing, everyone who made me feel like I was paranoid for noticing what was right in front of my face, enough to make sure they all know the truth. Jennifer stopped writing and looked at me directly. Mr. Mallard, what exactly are you hoping to accomplish here? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself for the past week. What did I want? Justice? Revenge? Public vindication? The satisfaction of watching Julia and Evan face the same humiliation they'd put me through? I want people to know the truth, I said finally. I want them to know that I wasn't the paranoid husband. I want them to know that Julia and Evan weren't just old friends catching up. I want them to know that this affair was conducted in full view of half the town while I was being told I was imagining things. And then what? Then they can make their own judgments about the kind of people who would do that to someone they claim to love. The story ran on the front page of the Millbrook Gazette's Thursday edition, under the headline, "Local Architect Files for Divorce, Alleges Affair." Jennifer had done her homework, interviewing sources at the Harbor Grill, the Marriott in Portsmouth, and several other locations where Julia and Evan had been seen together. She'd spoken to guests from the Christmas dinner, to co-workers at the Community Foundation, to neighbors who had noticed Evan's car in our driveway during the day when I was at work. The article was factual, well-sourced, and devastating. It painted a picture of a months-long affair conducted with breathtaking audacity, of a woman who had used her position in the community and her family's social standing to provide cover for her deception, of a man who had pursued another man's wife while playing the role of family friend. By Friday morning, the story had been picked up by the Portsmouth Herald and the Union Leader. By Saturday, it was trending on local social media, with comment threads that stretched into the hundreds. Everyone, it seemed, had an opinion about Julia and Evan's affair, and most of those opinions were not flattering. I stayed off social media and avoided the coffee shops and restaurants where I might run into people who wanted to discuss my personal life. But Dave kept me updated on the public reaction. "It's brutal," he reported over the phone Saturday morning. "Julia's getting roasted on Facebook. Someone started a group called Team Rick that already has 300 members. And Evan's dealership is getting review-bombed on Google." Review-bombed? People are leaving one-star reviews saying they wouldn't buy a car from someone who steals other people's wives. His average rating has dropped from 4.5 stars to 2.1 in 3 days. I felt a stab of something that might have been guilt, quickly followed by a much stronger surge of satisfaction. What about Julia? The Community Foundation put her on administrative leave, pending an investigation into whether she used foundation resources for personal business. Apparently, some of those hotel receipts you gave the reporter were charged to her foundation credit card. That was news to me, and not particularly welcome news. I'd wanted to humiliate Julia and Evan, not destroy their careers. There was a difference between public shaming and professional ruin, and I was starting to worry that I'd crossed a line I hadn't meant to cross. "Dave, I never intended for her to lose her job. Maybe you should have thought of that before you went to the press." He was right, of course. I'd been so focused on getting my story out, on making sure people knew the truth, that I hadn't fully considered the consequences. Julia might have betrayed our marriage, but she was good at her job. The Community Foundation did important work in our community, and her personal failings shouldn't necessarily disqualify her from professional success. But it was too late for second thoughts. The story was out there, the damage was done, and all I could do was watch the fallout spread through our small town like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. The ripples reached me on Sunday morning in the form of a phone call from Lorraine Hartwell. "Rick," she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "We need to talk." "Mrs. Hartwell, I don't think that's a good idea. Please, just give me 10 minutes. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her at a neutral location, the parking lot of a shopping center on the outskirts of town. She was waiting in her silver Lexus when I arrived, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. "Thank you for coming," she said when I got into the passenger seat. What did you want to talk about? I want you to make this stop. Make what stop? The newspaper articles, the social media harassment, the destruction of my daughter's reputation. I want you to make it stop. I stared at her, genuinely confused. Mrs. Hartwell, I can't control what other people write or say. I gave one interview to one reporter. Everything else is just people reacting to the facts. The facts as you presented them. The facts as they actually happened. She was quiet for a long moment, staring out the windshield at the empty shopping center. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. Julia made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but she doesn't deserve to have her entire life destroyed because of it. She didn't just make a mistake, I said. She conducted a months-long affair while lying to my face about it. She made me complicit in my own humiliation by asking me to be understanding about her friendship with Evan. She turned me into a joke in front of everyone who matters to us. And now you've turned her into a joke in front of the entire town. That's not what I intended, isn't it? She turned to look at me directly, and I saw something in her eyes that I'd never seen before. Fear. Rick, Julia is my daughter. Whatever she's done, however badly she's behaved, she's still my child. I'm begging you to show some mercy. The word hit me like a physical blow. Mercy. When had Julia shown me mercy? When had Evan? When had any of the people who had watched their affair unfold and said nothing? I'm not the one destroying Julia's reputation, I said. She did that herself when she decided to cheat on her husband with her ex-fiancé in full view of half the town. Please. Lorraine's voice broke on the word. I'll do anything. I'll pay for your legal fees. I'll make sure the divorce settlement is generous. Mrs. Hartwell, stop. Just stop. I got out of the car and walked back to my truck, leaving her sitting alone in the parking lot. As I drove home, I tried to tell myself that I felt vindicated, that justice was being served, that Julia and Evan were finally facing consequences for their actions. But mostly, I just felt tired. The phone was ringing when I walked into my house. I almost didn't answer it, but the caller ID showed Lisa's name, and she was the one member of Julia's family who had shown me any sympathy through this entire mess. Rick, she said when I picked up. How are you holding up? I've been better. I can imagine. Listen, I wanted to give you a heads up about something. Julia's planning to fight the divorce. What do you mean, fight it? She's hired a lawyer, a really expensive lawyer from Boston. She's going to claim that you've defamed her character, that the newspaper articles constitute harassment, that you've damaged her ability to earn a living. I sank into my kitchen chair, suddenly feeling every one of my 39 years. She can't be serious. She's very serious. And Rick, she's also claiming that you've been emotionally abusive throughout the marriage, that you've been controlling and manipulative, that the affair was her way of escaping an unhealthy relationship. That's insane. I know it's insane. You know it's insane. But her lawyer thinks it might work, especially given the media attention. She's going to paint herself as the victim of a vindictive ex-husband who used his connections with the press to destroy her life. I closed my eyes and tried to process this latest development. Julia wasn't just fighting the divorce. She was trying to rewrite the entire narrative of our marriage, to turn herself from the unfaithful wife into the abused victim. Lisa, you know that's not true. You've seen us together for 7 years. Have I ever been controlling or abusive? Of course not. But Rick, you need to understand something. Julia's desperate. Her career is in ruins, her reputation is destroyed, and Evan's been getting cold feet about their relationship now that it's public knowledge. She's got nothing left to lose, which makes her dangerous. What do you mean, Evan's getting cold feet? He's been having second thoughts about the whole thing. Apparently, being the other man was a lot more exciting when it was a secret. Now that everyone knows, now that his business is suffering and his own divorce is getting ugly, He's not so sure he wants to be with Julia after all. So Julia was losing everything. Her marriage, her job, her reputation, and now possibly the man she'd sacrificed it all for. Under other circumstances, I might have felt sorry for her. "Thanks for the warning," I said. "Rick, be careful. Julia's not thinking clearly right now, and people do desperate things when they're backed into a corner." After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about choices and consequences, about revenge and mercy, about the difference between justice and cruelty. I'd wanted Julia and Evan to face the same humiliation they'd put me through, and they had. But somewhere along the way, the public shaming had taken on a life of its own, becoming something bigger and more destructive than I'd intended. The question was whether I cared enough to try to stop it, or whether I was going to let it burn itself out and take Julia and Evan down with it. The answer came to me as I was getting ready for bed, in the form of a text message from an unknown number. "You think you've won, but this isn't over. Not by a long shot." I stared at the message for a long time, wondering if it was from Julia or Evan or someone else entirely. Then I deleted it and turned off my phone. If they wanted a war, they could have one, but they weren't going to win it. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in January, when I arrived at my office to find my assistant, Margaret, standing in the reception area with a grim expression and a manila envelope in her hands. "This was taped to the front door when I got here," she said, handing me the envelope. "No postmark, no return address." Inside were printed copies of what appeared to be emails between Julia and her Boston lawyer discussing strategy for the divorce proceedings. The emails detailed plans to subpoena my business records, to claim that I'd used company resources to hire the private investigator, to paint me as a controlling husband who had monitored Julia's every move. "Where did these come from?" I asked. "I have no idea. But Rick, if these are real, they're real." I recognized Julia's writing style, her tendency to over-explain and justify her actions even in private correspondence. "The question is, who got hold of them and why they're sharing them with me?" The answer came later that afternoon in the form of a phone call from Gus Patterson, the private investigator Carla had hired to document Julia's affair. "We need to meet," he said without preamble. "Tonight, somewhere private." I met him at a bar in Dover, a 40-minute drive from Millbrook, and far enough away to ensure we wouldn't run into anyone from town. Gus was a former state police detective, a man in his 60s with gray hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen everything human nature had to offer and hadn't been impressed by most of it. "Your wife's playing dirty," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. "Those emails this morning, those were from you?" "Friend of mine works security at the law firm Julia hired. He thought you should know what you're up against. Is that legal?" Gus shrugged. "Probably not, but neither is what she's planning to do to you." He pulled out a folder and spread several photographs across the table. They showed Julia and Evan together at various locations, restaurants, hotels, his house, her office. But there were also photos of other people. A man I didn't recognize entering Julia's apartment building, the same man leaving early in the morning. "Who is that?" I asked. "David Chen. He's a private investigator working for Julia's lawyer. He's been following you for the past 2 weeks, documenting your activities, looking for evidence to support their harassment claims." I stared at the photos, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the January weather. "Following me how?" "Your house, your office, the places you eat lunch, the gym you go to. They're building a case that you're obsessive, that you've been stalking Julia since the separation." "That's insane. I haven't even spoken to her since Christmas." "Doesn't matter. They've got photos of you driving past her apartment building, eating at restaurants where she used to work, shopping at the grocery store where she shops. Taken out of context, it looks like stalking behavior." I thought about my daily routines, the familiar patterns of a life lived in a small town where everyone shopped at the same stores and ate at the same restaurants. Of course, I'd driven past Julia's apartment. It was on the main road between my house and downtown. Of course, I'd eaten at places where she used to work. There were only so many restaurants in Millbrook. What else? I asked. They're going to claim you hacked her email account, that you've been monitoring her phone calls, that you hired me to harass her and Evan. I hired you to document an affair that was already happening. I know that. You know that. But Julia's lawyer is very good at spinning narratives, and the narrative he's spinning is that you're a controlling, obsessive husband who couldn't handle being left for another man. Gus gathered up the photos and put them back in the folder. There's something else. Julia's been meeting with a therapist, someone who specializes in domestic abuse cases. She's building a psychological profile to support her claims. A therapist who's never met me. Doesn't matter. She'll testify that Julia exhibits classic signs of having been in an emotionally abusive relationship. I finished my beer and tried to process what I was hearing. Julia wasn't just fighting the divorce. She was trying to destroy me, to turn me from the wronged husband into the abusive ex who had driven her into another man's arms. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because I don't like being lied to, and Julia's been lying to everyone from the beginning. Because I've seen what happens when good people get steamrolled by lawyers who care more about winning than about the truth. And because... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Because I think you deserve to know what's coming. What would you do in my position? I'd be very careful. I'd document everything, every interaction, every phone call, every email. I'd make sure I was never alone with Julia or anyone connected to her case. And I'd start thinking about how to protect myself, because this is about to get a lot worse before it gets better. The drive back to Millbrook gave me time to think about Gus's warnings and what they meant for my future. Julia wasn't just trying to win the divorce. She was trying to destroy my reputation, my business, possibly my freedom. The woman I'd been married to for 7 years, the woman I'd loved and trusted and built a life with, was now my enemy in the most literal sense of the word. But two could play that game. I called Carla from my truck as soon as I got home. We need to meet first thing tomorrow morning, I said. Julia's planning something, and we need to be ready for it. What kind of something? The kind that could put me in jail if we're not careful. The next morning's meeting with Carla was a crash course in defensive legal strategy. We went through Julia's likely arguments point by point, developing responses to each accusation she might make. We discussed the importance of documentation, of witnesses, of maintaining a paper trail that would contradict her narrative. The good news, Carla said, is that her strategy is risky. If she can't prove her claims about emotional abuse and harassment, it's going to backfire spectacularly. Judges don't like it when people make false accusations in divorce proceedings. And the bad news? The bad news is that if she can make even some of her claims stick, you're looking at a very expensive legal battle that could drag on for years, and even if you win, the accusations alone could damage your reputation permanently. So what do? We go on the offensive. We file a motion to dismiss her counterclaims as frivolous. We depose everyone who's had contact with both of you during the marriage. We make it clear that we're not going to be intimidated by false accusations. What about the media attention? She's claiming that constitutes harassment. That's the weakest part of her case. You gave one interview to one reporter about a matter of public interest. Everything else has been organic social media reaction. Unless she can prove you orchestrated a campaign against her, that claim won't hold water. I left Carla's office feeling more confident, but also more aware of the stakes involved. This wasn't just about ending a marriage anymore. It was about protecting everything I'd built over the past 7 years. My reputation, my business, my future. The battle lines were drawn, and there was no going back. The first shot in Julia's legal war came 3 days later, in the form of a restraining order filed in Rockingham County Superior Court. The petition, which was immediately picked up by Jennifer Walsh and published in the Gazette, painted me as a dangerous stalker who had been harassing Julia and her family since our separation. According to the filing, I had been conducting surveillance of Julia's residence, following her to various locations around town, and using media contacts to publicly humiliate and defame her character. The petition requested that I be prohibited from coming within 500 feet of Julia, her workplace, her apartment, and her parents' house. The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, which gave me exactly 4 days to prepare a defense against accusations that were both technically accurate and completely misleading. Yes, I had driven past Julia's apartment building because it was on Route 1, the main road through town. Yes, I had been to restaurants and stores where Julia also went because we lived in the same small town and shopped at the same places. Yes, I had given an interview to a reporter, but about my own divorce, not as part of some harassment campaign. Carla spent the weekend preparing our response, gathering witness statements from people who could testify to my character and behavior since the separation. Dave Morrison provided an affidavit describing our conversations and his observations of my emotional state. Margaret, my assistant, testified that I had been professional and focused at work, showing no signs of obsessive behavior. Even Tom Hartwell, despite his complicated position as Julia's father, provided a statement confirming that I had not attempted to contact Julia or her family since Christmas dinner. The hearing itself was a surreal experience, sitting in a courtroom while lawyers argued about whether I was a dangerous stalker or a wronged husband trying to move on with his life. Julia sat at the plaintiff's table looking fragile and frightened, playing the role of the victim with Oscar-worthy conviction. Her lawyer, a sharp-dressed man from Boston named Richard Caldwell, presented their case with the kind of theatrical flair that suggested he'd been watching too many legal dramas. According to Caldwell, I was a controlling husband who had become obsessed with destroying Julia's life after she had the courage to leave our toxic marriage. "Your Honor," he said, gesturing dramatically toward his client, "Ms. Hartwell lives in fear of what her estranged husband might do next. He has already used his media connections to destroy her career and reputation. He has hired private investigators to follow her. He has made her life a living nightmare, all because she had the strength to end an unhealthy relationship." Carla's response was more measured but equally effective. She presented evidence of Julia's affair, documented with photographs and witness statements. She showed that my surveillance consisted of normal activities in a small town where everyone's paths inevitably crossed. She pointed out that I had given exactly one interview to one reporter and that everything else had been organic public reaction to Julia's own behavior. "Your Honor," Carla said, "Mr. Mallard is not a stalker. He's a man whose wife conducted a public affair and is now trying to rewrite history to avoid taking responsibility for her actions. The real harassment here is Miss Hartwell's attempt to use the legal system to silence her ex-husband and escape the consequences of her own choices." The judge, a woman in her 50s with the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd heard every sob story in the book, listened to both presentations with obvious skepticism. When the lawyers finished their arguments, she asked a few pointed questions about the timeline of events and the evidence supporting each side's claims. "Ms. Hartwell," she said finally, "I'm not convinced that your ex-husband's behavior rises to the level of harassment or stalking. Living in the same small town inevitably means crossing paths with people you'd rather avoid. Giving one interview about your own divorce is not illegal. And frankly, the evidence suggests that much of the negative attention you've received is a direct result of your own documented behavior." Julia's face crumpled, but the judge wasn't finished. "However, Mr. Mallard, I want to be very clear about expectations going forward. You will make no attempt to contact Ms. Hartwell directly. You will conduct yourself with dignity and restraint. Any future media interviews or public statements should focus on your own experience, not on attacking your ex-wife's character." She denied the restraining order, but issued what amounted to a warning to both sides: behave like adults, or face the consequences. I left the courthouse feeling vindicated, but also exhausted by the entire process. Julia's strategy had failed, but the fact that she'd tried it at all was a reminder of how far she was willing to go to avoid taking responsibility for her actions. The war was far from over, but I'd won the first major battle. That evening, I was at home trying to catch up on work when I heard a car pull into my driveway. Through the window, I saw Evan's BMW, and my first thought was that he'd come to gloat about something or to threaten me in some misguided attempt to defend Julia's honor. I was wrong on both counts. Evan looked terrible when I opened the front door, unshaven, red-eyed, wearing clothes that suggested he'd been sleeping in his car. His usual confidence was nowhere to be seen, replaced by something that looked like desperation. "We need to talk," he said. "I don't think that's a good idea. Please, just 5 minutes." Against my better judgment, I let him in. He stood in my living room like a man who'd forgotten how to be comfortable in his own skin, looking around at the house where Julia had lived for 7 years. "She's lost her mind," he said without preamble. "Excuse me?" "Julia. She's completely lost her mind. The restraining order, the harassment claims, this whole victim narrative, it's insane." I stared at him, genuinely confused by this turn of events. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I need you to know that I never wanted any of this. The affair, yes. I wanted Julia back. I thought we belonged together. But this legal war, this public destruction, that's all her. You participated in the affair, Evan. You pursued a married woman for months. You came to family dinners and played the role of the family friend while sleeping with my wife. Don't try to pretend you're innocent in this. You're right, I'm not innocent, but I'm not crazy either." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that would have been theatrical if he hadn't looked so genuinely distressed. "Do you know what she asked me to do yesterday?" "I can't imagine." "She wanted me to testify at the restraining order hearing. She wanted me to say that you'd threatened me, that you'd been following me around town, that I was afraid for my safety. And I told her no, because it's not true, and because I'm not going to perjure myself to help her rewrite history." I sat down on my couch, trying to process this unexpected development. "So you're here to what? Apologize? Ask for forgiveness? Warn me about Julia's next move?" "All of the above, I guess." Evan remained standing, pacing around my living room like a caged animal. "Rick, I know you have no reason to believe me, but I need you to understand something. I loved Julia. I thought I still loved her. But the woman I fell in love with 6 years ago, the woman I thought I was getting back, she doesn't exist anymore." "What do you mean?" "I mean she's become someone I don't recognize, someone who lies without thinking about it, who manipulates everyone around her, who refuses to take responsibility for anything. The affair was wrong, but it was supposed to be about love, about two people who belonged together. Instead, it's become this nightmare of legal battles and public humiliation and revenge." "You're describing the woman I was married to for 7 years, I said. "I'm just surprised it took you this long to notice." Evan stopped pacing and looked at me directly for the first time since he'd arrived. "She told me you were controlling. She said you monitored her every move, questioned her friendships, made her feel like a prisoner in her own marriage. And you believed her." "I wanted to believe her. It made what we were doing feel justified, like we were rescuing her from something terrible instead of just cheating. But now you know better. Now I know that Julia tells people what they want to hear. She told me you were controlling because it made me feel like a hero for loving her. She told you I was just a friend because it made you feel paranoid for suspecting the truth. She told her parents we were just catching up on old times because it made them feel sophisticated for being so understanding." It was, I realized, a perfect summary of Julia's approach to relationships. She was a master at managing perceptions, at telling each person in her life exactly what they needed to hear, to keep them playing their assigned roles in her personal drama. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Now I'm done. I'm withdrawing from her life, from this whole situation. My divorce is going to be expensive enough without adding perjury charges to the mix." What about Julia? Julia's on her own, which frankly is probably what she's wanted all along. Evan left a few minutes later, driving away in his BMW like a man fleeing the scene of an accident. I watched him go and tried to figure out how I felt about his unexpected confession and apparent change of heart. The truth was, I didn't trust him any more than I trusted Julia. This could be another manipulation, another attempt to manage my perceptions and control the narrative. But it could also be genuine remorse from a man who had finally seen Julia clearly and didn't like what he'd discovered. Either way, it didn't change my situation. Julia was still trying to destroy me, still painting me as the villain in her personal drama, still refusing to accept responsibility for the choices that had led us to this point. But now she was doing it alone, without the support of the man she'd sacrificed our marriage to be with. Somehow, that felt like a victory all its own. The phone rang as I was getting ready for bed, Julia's name appearing on the caller ID for the first time since Christmas. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Rick. Her voice was quiet, subdued, nothing like the confident woman who had been fighting me in court just hours earlier. Julia, what do you want? I want to end this, all of it. The legal battles, the public fighting, the whole mess we've made of our lives. Okay, drop the harassment claims, agree to the original divorce terms, and we can be done with this by next month. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. You cheated, I filed for divorce, we divide our assets and move on. Everything else is just drama you've created to avoid taking responsibility for your choices. A long pause. Evan broke up with me. I know. He came to see you, didn't he? He did. What did he tell you? The truth, for once. That you've been lying to everyone, including him. That you tried to get him to perjure himself to support your harassment claims. That he finally figured out who you really are. Another pause, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. I never meant for any of this to happen. Yes, you did. Maybe not exactly this, but you meant for something to happen. You wanted the excitement of an affair, the validation of being desired by two men at once, the comfort of having options. You just didn't want to face the consequences. I loved you, Rick. I loved both of you. No, you didn't. You loved the idea of us, the roles we played in your life, but you didn't love us enough to be honest with us or with yourself. So what happens now? I thought about that question, about the future that stretched ahead of both of us, about the choices that had brought us to this moment and the choices that would determine where we went from here. Now you decide who you want to be, I said. The woman who takes responsibility for her actions and tries to rebuild her life with dignity, or the woman who keeps fighting battles she can't win and blaming everyone else for the consequences of her own choices. And if I choose wrong? Then you'll spend the rest of your life wondering why you're always the victim in your own story. I hung up the phone and turned off the lights, leaving Julia to contemplate her options in whatever lonely place she was calling home these days. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, new opportunities for both of us to choose who we wanted to be in the aftermath of our marriage's destruction. But tonight, for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally sleep peacefully in the house that was now truly mine alone. The war was over, even if Julia didn't know it yet.